So let's work through a few examples in 1.7. So here we're dealing with multiplication. So we need to remind ourselves of a couple of things. If we have a positive times a positive, that makes a positive. If we have a negative times a negative, what does that make? A negative and a negative touching, that says the opposite of a negative, which is a positive. A positive times a negative, positive means the same. So the same as a negative is negative. Or if you have a negative times a positive, the opposite of a positive is negative. So two negatives, sometimes we say an even amount of negatives is positive. An odd amount of negatives is negative. So here when we multiply these together, we take care of the sign first. We have a negative times a negative, which makes a positive. And then 2 times 10, which is 20. Here, if there's not a sign with the 3, it's understood to be positive. So we have a positive times a negative, which is negative. 3 times 5 is 15. So it's different from adding and subtracting, where when we add or subtract, we take the sign based on the largest number. But when we multiply, it's based on, do we have positives times positives, positives times negatives, or negatives times negatives. Here we have a negative 9 times 0. Anything times 0 is 0. Okay, here we're multiplying and we have fractions. So we still multiply like we normally multiply fractions, but a negative times a negative makes a positive. And we can reduce before we multiply. 8 goes into 8 once. 8 goes into 16 twice. 5 goes into 5 once. 5 goes into 15 3 times. So we're left with 1 times 2 on top, 1 times 3 on bottom. So we get positive 2/3. So after we take care of the signs, and just multiply like we normally multiply fractions. Here we have a positive times a negative, so our answer should be negative. And we need to multiply these two digits together, or these two numbers together. So how do we multiply decimals? Well, we multiply the 3 times both numbers. So 3 times 7 is 21. So we put down a 1, carrier 2. 3 times 0 is 0 plus 2. And then we do 0 times each. 0 times 7 is 0. 0 times 0 is 0. So when we add our columns, we get 0 to 1. But the question is, where does our decimal go? So for the top number, there's 1 digit to the right of the decimal. On the bottom, there's 1 digit to the right of the decimal, so we have a total of 2. So 2 digits to the right of the decimal, so our answer needs 2 digits to the right of the decimal. So 0.21. Let's do another one of those. Let's do negative 1.2. Let's rewrite that. Negative 1.2 times negative 2.3. So negative times negative makes a positive, and then we need to do 1.2 times 2.3. So 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 1 is 3. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 1 is 2. Notice when we multiplied by 3, we put the first answer under the 3. When we multiply by 2, we put the first answer under the 2. Then we add our columns. We count our decimals. two numbers to the right of the decimal, so 1, 2 numbers to the right. So positive 2.76 should be our final answer. Okay, here we have 4 numbers multiplied together. So we can just multiply straight across. When we multiply the first 2 together, we have a negative times negative, and 2 times 5 is 10. Then bring down the other numbers. Then we do 10 times 7. Positive times positive is positive. 10 times 7 is 70. And then we bring down the negative 2. Positive times negative is negative. And 70 times 2, 2 times 7 is 14. So 140. So if we have several numbers to multiply together, no need to do them all at one time. We could multiply straight across. You can also rearrange them, or you can group them together, but you can also just go straight across. Here we have an exponent. So remember what happens with exponents. That means we write our base that many times. So we write a negative 2 3 times, and we multiply those together. So negative 2 times negative 2, well, a negative times a negative is positive. 2 times 2 is 4. And then we bring down our negative 2. Positive times negative is negative. 4 times 2 is 8. Now, while we're on this subject, let's compare that to a similar problem. Let's do negative 5 to the second. Notice how the one on the right does not have parentheses around it, while the one on the left does. The one on the left, the base is negative 2, so we write negative 2 out 3 times. But the one on the right, the base is not negative 5. The base is just 5. So we write 5 twice. And whatever we get for that answer, we put a negative out front. So if there's a parenthesis around the negative, that is part of the base. But if there is not a parenthesis around the negative is not part of the base, so it doesn't get repeated. So 5 times 5 is 25, and then we put a negative out front. Here we're dividing, and the same rules that apply for multiplying about signs apply for dividing. If we have a negative and a positive make a negative when we're either multiplying or dividing. And 24 divided by 6 is 4. Let's do another one. If we had negative 18 divided by negative 9, a negative divided by a negative is positive, and 18 divided by 9 is 2. This one and the next one people often get backwards, so this is something you need to memorize, but it is very important to know this. 0 divided by a number is 0. So let's think about what that means. Let's take an example of something that's not 0 and think about what dividing represents. If I have a container and I have 6 cookies in it, and I want to divide that into 2 groups, or let me say it this way, divide it into groups of 2. Either way. So if I take it and divide that container into groups of 2, there are 2, there are 2, and there are 2. So how many groups of 2 do we get? Well, we get 3. But either way we look at it, if we think about dividing it into 2 groups, they would have 3 in them, or if we divide it into groups of 2, they would have 3. But let's use that same thought here. Let's say in our container we have no cookies. And I want to divide that container into 3 equal size groups. And I'm going to give those cookies to 3 people. So I'm going to divide all of my cookies up equally. And one person's going to get these, another person is going to get these, and another person's going to get these. Well, if everybody gets the same amount and there are no cookies in the container, then everybody gets none. So if I don't have anything, 0, nada, and I divide it up equally, then each of the 3 people are going to get nothing. On the other hand, if we have a 0 on bottom, this is said to be undefined. What does it mean to divide something by 0? If I have cookies in my container, if I don't divide it at all, then I have one group. I have one group. If I divide it by 2, or divide it in 2, I have groups of 3. Or if I divide it by 3, I don't want to say it. If we divide it by 2, we could say that, and we have 3 groups. Or if we divide it with 3s. But if we say we're going to divide it by 0, well, if we don't divide it at all, there's one group. So how can we divide it so that there are no groups and there still be 6 in there? Well, you can't. If you have something, you can't divide it into no groups, because by default, if you don't do anything, you have at least one group. So division by 0 is undefined. We can't really quantify what that means. So let's do a couple more examples. Here we do order of operation. If we have a fraction, we do everything that's on top and everything that's on bottom separately. So on top, we have a negative times negative. 7 times 2 is 14. On bottom, we have a negative 6. Well, 6 doesn't go into 14 evenly, but we can reduce this. A positive divided by a negative is negative. 2 goes into 14. 2 also goes into 6. So we have simplified that. We do this one. We have an 18 on top. On bottom, we have an 8 minus 14. So remember, if we are adding or subtracting, we can't just say, well, there's a minus in the middle, so we always subtract. We subtract if the signs are different. So if the signs are different, we subtract the numbers, take the sign of the bigger number. Now, a positive divided by a negative is negative, and 18 divided by 6 is 3. Some people might say, well, why didn't I divide before I subtract? Because that's what Aunt Sally told me to do. Well, remember, again, with fractions, you have to simplify the top altogether, simplify the bottom altogether, and then you take care of the dividing. So if we simplify the bottom to one number, then we can simplify that fraction by dividing. Okay, if we simplify the top, we have a subtraction and we have an exponent. Subtraction and exponent. So the exponent comes first. 3 squared means 3 times 3. On bottom, we have multiplying. A positive times negative is negative. 6 times 1 is 6. Now the bottom, there are no other terms, but the top, 15 minus 9, we can subtract, and then we can simplify. A positive divided by a negative is negative. Any number over itself makes 1.